Hey everyone, welcome to another Tea with EC. I was going to tell you this one outside. I have a whole flask of tea, but then an entire battalion of cockatoos descended on me, so we're back inside. Today I want to tell you a fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm. So we're moving away from British folklore just for a minute, and the fairy tale is called The Nixie and the Millpond, and I think a lot of you won't have heard of it, but it's one of my favourite fairy tales. It's a fairy tale about love, which has been on my mind lately, and it's a fairy tale about, it's not about that kind of, bolt from the blue, love at first sight kind of love that we see in some of the better known fairy tales like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty. It's a fairy tale about enduring love, the kind of love that has to be fought for to continue, which I think is why I like it. So go grab yourself a cup of tea and let's have a story. Now, once upon a time, there was a wealthy miller and his wife, and they were very happy. But over time, their wealth grew less and less until the miller was worried about how he was going to continue and how he was going to put food on the table. And on a long walk, as he pondered these dark thoughts, he crossed over the bridge of the Millpond, and up out of the Millpond came a beautiful woman with long dark hair covering her naked body, and the miller knew at once that it was the Nixie of the Millpond. Now, we know from our passing knowledge of folklore that beautiful, beguiling women coming out of the water are generally bad news, and the miller wasn't sure whether to run away or not. But she looked at him with such kindness, they're good at that, and said to him, "Tell me all your troubles." And so he did. And the Nixie said to him, "I will solve all your problems. I will make you so wealthy you'll never have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. And all I ask in return is that little thing that's just been born at your house." And the miller, for some reason, thought that this might be a cat or a dog. Why do they do this? Had he not been paying attention to his wife for the last 9 months? Apparently not. When he went home, of course, she had just borne him a son. So the miller's wife was like, "Why aren't you happy? We've got a beautiful son." And the miller was like, "Oh, darling, I just promised him to the Nixie in the Millpond." So the miller and his wife took great care as the little boy grew up not to let him go anywhere near the Millpond. And as he grew from a baby into a young boy into a beautiful young man, and there was no sign of the Nixie, they began to worry a little bit less. But they still warned him never to go near the pond. Now the young man was apprenticed to a hunter, and he fell in love with a girl from the next village, and they were married. And the Lord gave them a little house, and they lived together, and they were very happy. But one day, while the hunter was out, and coming home from a successful hunt and needed to wash his hands, he went to the nearest body of water, and of course it happened to be the Millpond. No sooner had his hand touched the water than the Nixie came up out of the water, and she wrapped her arms around him, and she wrapped her long hair around him, and she drew him down under the surface. When he didn't come home, his wife knew immediately what must have happened. After all, he'd been telling her the whole time he knew her, "I mustn't go near the Millpond," and he wasn't the kind of man to not come home at night. She ran to the Millpond, and when she saw his hunting bow lying on the banks, she knew what had happened. Then she wept and she wailed and she cursed and she cried and she said some very nasty things about the Nixie, but not a single ripple ruffled the surface of the pond. And eventually she fell into an exhausted slumber on the banks. And as she slept, she dreamed about climbing this tall mountain and the sharp rocks and spiky thorns and the wild wind that tried to push her off the side of the mountain. But when she made it to the top, there was a beautiful, calm green meadow, and in the meadow a little cottage, and in the cottage an old woman. And the next morning when she woke up, with no better plans for how to get her husband back, she decided to follow what she'd seen in her dream. So she climbed up the mountain, and an arduous journey it was, and she got to the top and she found the little meadow and the cottage and the old woman. And the woman said to her, "You must truly be in a pickle to have climbed up that mountain and come to me for help. Let's see what I can do." And she gave her a golden comb and told her to brush her hair on the banks of the Millpond at the next full moon. And this was a struggle for the poor wife because it was still a few weeks to the full moon and she really wanted to act immediately. But she waited dutifully, and at the full moon she combed her hair by the side of the Millpond, and then she put the comb down on the bank. And immediately a little ripple came up and picked up the comb and pulled it into the water. And in the time it takes for a comb to sink to the bottom of a millpond, her husband's head rose up out of the water, and he looked at her with longing but didn't say anything. And then a little wave came and pushed him back under the water. The next day the wife didn't know what to do, and so she climbed the mountain again. And this time the old woman said to her, I will give you a golden flute. Don't play it until the full moon. So at the full moon, a whole month of waiting, the wife went back to the pond and she played this mournful air on the flute, and then she laid it on the banks of the pond, and a wave came up and picked up the flute and pulled it into the pond. And in the time it takes for a flute to sink to the bottom of a mill pond, her husband's head and half his body came out of the water, and he reached for her with longing arms, and then a wave came and pushed him back beneath the surface. Well, the next morning the wife knew what to do. She climbed the mountain a third time, and this time the old woman said to her, I will give you a golden spinning wheel. Don't spin it until the full moon. And so the wife took the spinning wheel to the banks of the pond, and she spun and spun until she had a spoolful of thread. And then she put the spinning wheel down on the bank, and a huge wave came along and picked up the entire spinning wheel and pulled it into the pond. And as it did so, her husband's entire body rose out of the pond, and he leapt to the bank and he grabbed her by the hand, and they ran. But the Nixie wasn't going to let go of her prize that easily. She caused all the water of the pond to come up and chase after them, and they saw death closing in from every side. In desperation, the woman cried out to the old woman on the mountain to save them, and she turned them both into frogs. This is a fairy tale after all. Now, as frogs, they were safe, but they were washed far, far away from each other, far away from the lands they knew, and when they regained their human form, they had no way to get home. And so, as it happened, they both became shepherds, and they wandered lonely, occupations that kept them in their solitude by themselves. And as chance would have it, one day in a lonely valley far away, they came across each other. But the magic was still over their eyes, and they didn't recognize each other. And yet, still, something in each of them spoke to the other one, and they felt comforted in each other's presence. And from that day forth, they drove their sheep out together, and they would spend the days in silence, but companionable silence, with each other. Until one day, the man pulled out a wooden flute and began to play a beautiful, mournful song. And he looked at the woman, and she was crying and crying, and he said to her, what's wrong? And she said, the last time I heard that song, I played it on a golden flute, and my husband came out of the pond and reached for me and then was snatched away again. And as soon as she said this, the scales fell from their eyes, and they recognized each other. And no one need ask if they were happy. Thanks, everyone. Illustrations is always up on social media, more stories coming on videos soon, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.